I think overall, I feel like we did pretty good on our test last week. So, that there are a lot of people conspicuously absent. Happen to just be absent the Sunday I give our Exodus quiz too.
So what does that tell you?
That's it.
This taskmaker.
We'll get used to it.
Financial planning manager, so I've got a team of analysts that do all of the finance,
I don't have many pictures of them because I had one that used to work for senior.
Okay.
So, what's your name for this?
Maddox. Maddox is really
So,
no, they're privately held.
Okay.
yeah. Makes you feel better. I'm doing your lights on. Recovery.
How you doing?
I still need a calculator for everything.
Yeah.
No, I couldn't stand that way.
We have Kathy here. Bacon. No, I mean yesterday. It was in the oven. They were baking it. No, everybody was wondering.
When I drink coffee, that's all that is. So I'll myself my every day.
I agree.
It's like a magnet.
You know,
Well, the only
More like a nice shirt, they have a white t-shirt underneath it, and just have it covered everywhere. I was like, you're pretty bold to wear a white t-shirt to dinner, you know?
oh yeah, oh yeah.
after I.
There's a place in downtown Boise called Good Change. It's phenomenal.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, and
I wish I had street lights where I could.
Banning.
it's on base.
Yes. Yeah, right down there by the freeway.
Yep.
It's really good.
Okay, good.
Yeah. It's right across the street. Do you know where Ten Barrel Brewing is?
Yes.
It's right across the street.
Oh, that's easy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
We are still
Looking for
good places.
good.
There's not as many of them as there would be in
In
Washington.
Washington.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, as we get started, as we have people continuing to filter in, I'd invite you to turn to the book of Genesis.
Oh, Johnny.
Genesis chapter 22. So as people are continuing to filter in, I invite you to turn to Genesis 22.
This is one of my saying that
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our look at the book of the Exodus, we're going to be taking some time to wrap up the thematic impacts of the Exodus, both old and new, so going backwards and going forwards. So as we start in Genesis chapter 22, we're seeing perhaps the first prefiguring of the major Exodus event in the Old Testament. And with that in mind, could I get a volunteer to read Genesis 22, 1 through 8, please? Genesis 22, verses 1 through 8. Could I get a volunteer to read that? Thank you.
Sometime later, God tested Abram. He said to him, "Abram, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him excuse me, 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. How far?
Yep. So we're starting back with the sacrifice of Isaac as a way to think about the impact of the Exodus prior to the actual event of the Exodus. And so if we wanted to think about, as we're reading through the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, what event this passage of Genesis 22 prefigures, I want you to keep that in mind. I'm not going to say more than that because I want you to put on your critical thinking caps. I know it's 9:09 on Sunday morning and it's been a long and beautiful weekend, and if you're like me, you spent a lot of time outside. The UV light has fried your brain. The synapses are not firing quite as efficiently as normal. So just kind of helping you be ready, be open to seeing the thematic impact of the Exodus event across both, again, Old Testament and New. With that in mind, could I get a volunteer to read 9 through 19, please? 9 through 19 of Genesis 22.
When they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from the heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it on as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Is that as far as you want to do? 19?
Through 19, yeah.
Okay. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand of the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all of the nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba.
Thank you. So, as we think about Moses, as we think about the work of God in the Exodus, both old and new, let me get my PowerPoint pulled up here for that so we can track along with the themes. And I want you to have your pencils and papers and notes ready. But with that in mind, anybody want to try to take a guess about what event in the Exodus is prefigured by the events of Genesis chapter 22? Well, what happens to Isaac is he sacrifices the firstborn sacrifice for Abraham, the father of many nations. Abraham, the person who out of him and his descendants would come Israel. Is his firstborn son killed? No. We have the Passover, if you will, prefigured in this interaction between Abraham, Isaac, and Yahweh here, or God, in Exodus 22, or Genesis 22. We have the passing over of the firstborn as the means by which God will demonstrate his faithfulness, his life, his salvation for not just Abraham, but for his descendants through the line of Isaac. And so it's those sorts of patterns of thinking that I want us to have in mind as we are navigating our way through both Old and New Testament, especially again with the Exodus in mind and how that anticipates and prefigures the work of the Messiah and the incarnation of Jesus Christ, that is the Word becoming flesh and making his dwelling among us. So when we see the sacrifice of Isaac and the preservation of God of both Isaac, Abraham, and his future descendants, we can think about it as a prefiguring of the Passover itself, when the firstborn of Israel is passed over and the continued work of God is made known. Any questions or comments on that as we think about Abraham and Isaac as a prefiguring of the Passover event? Again, the idea of God passing over what is necessary to make satisfaction for sins. God passing over death and into life is not just present there at that actual event in Exodus, but as a part of the larger plan of salvation, again, for the Messiah, who comes about to bring life and salvation to humanity. And speaking of Abraham, I just want us to think about the nature of Abraham's life as it relates to the way in which we see it structured and arranged from a literary perspective. So we have a unique format in the text that we see mirrored elsewhere in smaller ways. And the name of this format is called a chiastic structure. So to see an example of what a chiastic structure looks like, I invite you to turn to Psalm 8.
How do you spell that?
I'll put it on the board here, if I can find what Atlas may have done with any of example of what the sacrifices in the Old Testament do to sin. Kind of. So we have a chiastic structure in the life of Abraham. And so again, to see what the chiastic structure looks like, let's turn again, as I said, to Psalm 8. Could I get a volunteer to read Psalm 8 for us? Thank you.
For the director of music is holy to hear a song of David. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name on all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise, because of your enemies and silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of? The son of man that you care for him. You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over all the works of his hands. You put everything under his feet, all flocks and birds, all the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, all that swim the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
So a chiastic structure is where, whether it's a psalm, whether it's, for example, Abraham's life in the narrative, it begins and ends in the same way. So how does Psalm 8 begin and end? O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And each passage, each sort of section in between the chiasm builds towards the central point. And so when we look at Psalm 8, for example, in terms of this chiastic structure, we recognize that we have creation from a macro perspective, narrowing its way in until we get to the central point of Psalm 8. Anybody want to take a guess at what is the central point and part and parcel of Psalm 8? Verse 5, yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. That verse is directly quoted in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, and it is applied to Jesus. So the whole point of Psalm 8 in the chiastic structure is to point to the central idea, or the central event. And in this case, in Psalm 8, it is the crowning of glory and honor of God's Son, which is exactly what we see again recorded in the book of Hebrews concerning the person of Christ. So in the story and person of Abraham, again, we see this chiastic structure take place. Oops. Don't want to skip ahead too much. Although now you're intrigued and you're wondering what decreation is going to refer to. But Abraham's life begins and ends with an odyssey, with a travel. So Abraham's life begins with an exodus out of Ur, and concludes in Exodus 22 with the redemption of Isaac and the firstborn. And then, so let me just put it in here for you, just so we can have this on. So, we have spiritual odyssey and spiritual odyssey. We have rescue and rescue, specifically of Abraham and Sarai. Sorry, well, you all know by now my handwriting is pretty poor. So they are, in a sense, rescued, let me put it this way. Abram himself, and Abraham later on, rescues. And then we have covenant. And covenant. and the changing of the name from Abram to Abraham. So, when we see name changes in Scripture, they're usually rather significant for a whole host of reasons. But what is aside from Abram to Abraham, and I suppose Simon to Peter, but what's the other real prominent name change that identifies what God is doing in the life of his people? Saul to Paul. And what's significant about that name change from Saul to Paul? Yeah, you're going from an S to a P. That's a completely different direction in terms of vocals, right? But no, Saul to Paul, Saul is a Hebrew name. So it would be Shaul in Hebrew. And then Paul is an inherently Greek name. Paulos is what that would be in Greek. And so you have a complete transformation of Paul's identity, his mission, and his purpose in life. Because as Saul, who is he?
He's the apostle of the Gentiles.
Well, as Saul, who is he?
Oh.
He's a Pharisee of Pharisees. He's a Jew of Jews. He is somebody completely and wholly steeped into the Old Covenant, so much so that he is actively persecuting people who are under the New Covenant. That is, folks like St. Stephen, monitoring and approving of his execution. But then as Paul, he becomes, as you point out, a missionary to the Gentiles. And not only does he become a missionary to the Gentiles, in a sense he becomes the Roman of Romans, right? He flaunts his Roman citizenship, which in the Roman world is not something that is easily gotten. Usually you have to either be born into a family that has citizenship, and even then, the prior generations either rendered a great service to Rome, had connections to royalty, or had served the army in a significant way and made contributions to the larger empire. So even if you were born in Rome and lived there your whole life, you were not necessarily a citizen. A citizen was a very unique privilege afforded to few within the context of the Roman world. But Paul, as we know in his missionary journeys, uses his citizenship to his advantage to make his way so that he could preach the gospel to not just to Rome, but before Caesar himself. And in the course of this, we see Paul and his ways of thinking and his communication become completely oriented to the Gentiles. Again, even to the point where when he's debating people on Mars Hill in Athens, who is he using as the means by which to start the conversation and to bridge the gap between himself as a proclaimer of Jesus Christ and the pagan philosophers and students on Mars Hill? The statue of the unknown God, and he's quoting pagan philosophy from the Epicureans and the Stoics. And not necessarily in a completely dismissive way, but rather using that as the first stepping stone to the full truth and revelation found in the person of Jesus Christ and his death, and especially his resurrection from the dead. So when we have a transformation of names, we see that that is a significant and seismic change. And so in the person of Abraham and his life, we are seeing this chiastic structure working towards his name change, which is at the center of his story. And so we have the covenants coming right on either side of that name change, whether it's before the name change where he has a vision of Israel, or whether it's after the name change where again he has a vision of Israel, and not just Israel to go, but Israel to leave and have his people and his nation be established. And again we have Abraham rescuing. We also have Abraham and Sarah, Abram and Sarai themselves be rescued. And all of this is in the larger bookend framework, the chiastic framework of a spiritual journey, pilgrimage, odyssey, or in the case of our discussion today, Exodus, in which, again, Abraham and Isaac prefigures the passing over. Abraham and his life prefigures the spiritual odyssey and departure out of death into life, which, remember that death into life is going to come to be very important as we navigate the Exodus, both old and new. That being said, any questions or comments on that chiastic structure, both of Abraham's life, but just the idea of a chiasm in general? Yeah?
Well, you know, there is another quality that seems like to be been instilled into some of these people that God chose, and that was their zeal to serve God. Even though its author was misdirected. Peter had that, and Paul certainly had that. In other words, even though he was persecuting the church, he actually believed he was serving God.
Yeah.
In all his efforts, and he was going full force. You know, he wasn't sitting on the sidelines anymore. He was going to go out and purge the world of these heretics.
Yeah. So that reminds me of this quote from C.S. Lewis, where he talks about the worst kind of tyranny is the one that is exercised out of a sincere concern for the good of those who are victims of such tyranny. And certainly we see that in the persecution of people like Stephen at the hands of Paul, or Saul at that time. It was that zealous zeal for the message and the hope of the old covenant that completely blinded him to the reality of the new covenant and the fulfillment of God in the Old Testament through the person of Jesus Christ.
But how wonderful is zeal when it's going in the right direction.
Exactly, exactly. And it's a matter of where is the zeal coming from? Is it coming from through the power of the Holy Spirit and the power of the hearing of the proclamation of Christ and Him crucified, or is it coming out of the power of one's pride, knowledge, and understanding? That's the difference. So again, Exodus old and new, the first major figure that prefigures the Exodus before it actually happens, again, is Abraham, culminating both with his name change and his vision looking in and out of the land of Egypt, but also the prefiguring of the Passover in Genesis 22, in which God passes over Isaac as a sacrifice and provides that ram out of the bush as a substitute. And then as we continue on, we think of Exodus and creation and decreation. So, with that in mind, let's continue in the book of Genesis, but let's go back all the way to Genesis chapter 1. If you can't find Genesis 1, just go to the first page of most of your Bibles, or unless you have like a study Bible, it's like the 100th page. But,
Pastor, could I say something about the name, the significance?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah.
so I was thinking about what you were saying, like, the name change, right?
Mhm.
Like, obviously we know that Abraham's name used to be Abram, but like, nobody refers to him as that. You know, and it's like in Genesis, right, in the beginning, it's like the thing, a created object cannot find its identity without having received its name. And so, therefore, God, in incorporating man into the creative act, has Adam name the animals. And it's like you can't understand what that animal is without the name. And so, like with Saul, like we're talking about Saul and Paul, and his first name Saul, he's named after a giant in the history of the Hebrews, right? A king who started out great and didn't end so great, you know. And the fascinating thing with the name change is how New Testament Saul, he almost adopts this new identity. Don't quote me on this, but I believe Paul means small one. And Samuel said to the Old Testament Saul, he said, "You were once small in your own eyes."
yeah.
You know, you were once humble, right? And so it really, I think a name can add great significance.
Well, I mean,
Someone's
that's why
identity.
it's such important, for example, in the person of Jesus at the Annunciation, which happened just a couple of weeks ago on March 25th. Which, by the way, why is the Annunciation, that is the appearance of the angel to Mary, on March 25th? Because 9 months later is December 25th.
Makes sense.
So, I once had a professor, it's changed my life in terms of my academic understanding, who said that education was a grasp of the obvious. And that was so helpful because so many times we get stuck as a class kind of thinking through concepts, and we were just thinking and trying way too hard. When Occam's razor is true almost in every level of education, the simplest solution is often the best one. And so, so the question, why March 25th for the Annunciation? You don't necessarily have to go through the whole Rolodex of your biblical understanding, just 9 months after March 25th is December 25th. So. Thank you for not letting me be possessed by demons. Oh, in case you wonder why I said that, if you didn't know, in the medieval world, well, they thought sneezes were one of two things. Either it was you expelling a demonic force or an evil force, or as you sneeze, if you didn't, so nobody said God bless you in time, then a demonic force would enter in. Yeah, so that's where the origin of God bless you as a response to a sneeze came about in the Western world. Well, good luck. Godspeed. Let's turn to Genesis 1. We're just going to look at verses 1 and 2 to look at Exodus and creation and new creation. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, the darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So one of the big themes that we see, especially in interpretation of Genesis, is this idea of God, in a sense, taming the chaos of the world. And I actually heard a really fascinating discussion that looked at the comparison between the story of Gilgamesh and the epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish versus the creation in Genesis 1. And oftentimes critics of Christianity will say that the Bible stole from the epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish. But the reality is they actually have opposite intentions. It's almost as if when Moses was composing Genesis, and he knows the pagan beliefs of the world around him, he's recording the work of God in creation as an apologetic against some of those ancient stories. This chaos of the waters, the darkness was over the face of the deep, the earth was without form and void, etc. God brings about order into his creation when he speaks the universe into existence. It is an ordered and good world. Whereas if you read the things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, etc., it is a fundamentally disordered world that gets even more impacted by the gods descending and fighting, and out of their fighting and whatnot comes creation and life and different aspects of the world that we live in.